Good afternoon and welcome to the Program for Public Discourse Debating Public Policy Series. I'm Kevin Marinelli, Executive Director of the program. The Program for Public Discourse strives to promote democratic values by fostering robust discursive practices in the classroom, across Carolina, and beyond. And we do that first by engaging issues that are tough and socially significant, and second, by transcending the simplistic either or binary of politics to ask questions that are more nuanced, more complex, and frankly, more interesting. And today is no exception as we engage the issue of reparations. The concept of reparation appears to be a universal one and often hotly contested. Perhaps the most prominent example of reparations on a large scale are those paid out to victims of the Holocaust in Germany still today. Most recently, there's been talk about paying victims of global climate change reparations in the developing world, as these people suffer the greatest consequences and contribute least to global climate change. In the context of the United States, discussions around reparations focus specifically on the legacy of American slavery. Historically, discussions around reparations have entered and then receded from the mainstream of public discourse. However, in 2014, there was a provocative essay written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which appeared in The Atlantic, which regalvanized momentum around reparations, which was then sustained by the Black Lives Matter movement, which continues still today. So today, we're going to take a deeper dive into the discussion of reparations in the American context with three leading scholars on the topic. Our first panelist, William Darity Jr., affectionately known as Sandy, is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. He has served as chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. Previously, he served as director of the Institute of African American Research, director of the Moore Undergraduate Research Apprenticeship Program, director of the Undergraduate Honors Program in Economics, and director of Graduate Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Randall Kennedy is Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He was born in Columbia, South Carolina. For his education, he attended St. Albans School, Princeton University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. He served as law clerk for Judge J. Skelly Wright of the United States Court of Appeals and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. He is a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and the Supreme Court of the United States. And our discussion today is going to be moderated by our own Osamudia James, who joined the UNC School of Law faculty in 2021. Her writing and teaching interests include education law, race in the law, administrative law, and torts. James is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and popular press commentary exploring the interaction of law and identity in the context of public education. Her work has appeared in NYU Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, and the Minnesota Law Review, among others, as well as in the pages of the New York Times and Washington Post. And I should also add that Sandy Darity has recently published a book, which the PPD has secured copies of and will distribute at our upcoming event in the spring on affirmative action. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand it over to our panelists for today.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and welcome to all our participants, whether you are joining us from far away or from someplace here on campus. We're delighted to have you. I'm also delighted to have our two discussants with us today. Hello, Professor Kennedy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Hello, Professor Darity. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start off with a definition. I want to jump right in. And the word reparations is related to the word repair, right? Both come from the Latin word meaning to restore. And so our conversation today is really about the viability of reparations as a way to repair racial inequality in the United States, or maybe even restore it to what it might have been if racial subordination was not so central to sort of early development and founding of the United States. And so trying to get us all on the same page, let's start talking about what reparations might be for, right? I've already made a reference back to enslavement in the United States. What would reparations be for? Professor Darity, I'll start with you.
Well, let me start by attempting to define reparations. The definition that Kirsten Mullen and I use in our book, From Here to Equality, is reparations is a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. So this would be a general definition that would be applicable to any instance in which there is some sort of compensatory action that needs to be taken for an atrocity or for a series of atrocities. And by acknowledgement, we mean that the culpable party admits that it has committed such a grievous injustice and simultaneously makes a commitment to engage in an act of restitution for those atrocities. The second component, redress, is the actual act of compensation, usually taking the form, when we're concerned about victimized communities, usually taking the form of some type of monetary payment, whether it's the payments that were made to victims of the Holocaust that were previously mentioned by Professor Marinelli, or in the US case, payments that were made to Japanese Americans who were subjected to unlawful and unjust mass incarceration during the course of World War II. And then the third component of reparations, and under our definition, is closure, which is the point at which the culpable party and the victimized community come to an agreement that the account has been settled. And at that point, the victimized community will make no further claims for restitution on the from the culpable party unless there is a renewal of the atrocities or there's a new wave of atrocities that takes place directed against them.
Okay. So in the United States, what might we see? Let's say we were making reparations. So what would reparations be responding?
Well, there's a host of atrocities that have been committed by the United States to which reparations could be responding. But I think in our conversation today, obviously our primary concern is about reparations for African Americans. And from that standpoint, reparations would be something that would be enacted for the purposes of addressing the full array of atrocities that have been directed against Black Americans from slavery into the present moment. So this would include the period of legal segregation in the United States, which was accompanied by a wave of upwards of 100 massacres that took place all across the country. In the year 1919 alone, there were about 35 of these massacres that took place where white terrorists not only murdered Black Americans, but also seized and appropriated their personal property. And then in the post-civil rights period, we have ongoing mass incarceration. We have police executions of unarmed Blacks. We have ongoing discrimination in housing, credit, and employment markets. And most significant from the standpoint of the project for reparations that I envision is the persistence of a massive racial wealth gap, which constitutes the best cumulative economic indicator of the intergenerational consequences of white supremacy in the United States. And so from my perspective, the minimum condition for a reparations program for Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved here is a project that would eliminate the racial wealth gap, which would require an expenditure of at least $14 trillion.
Okay, so I want to talk about time as a key site of contestation when we're thinking about reparations. Yuvraj Joshi, he's a faculty member at Allard, talks about how Americans think about the past. His argument is that whites think about the past as past, right? But maybe Black Americans think about the past as constituting the present. And those are different lenses for thinking about how far back reparations might go. Professor Kennedy, do you have thoughts about the timeline, right, that we've already invoked in terms of what reparations would be responsive to?
Well,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I thought the question was asked of me. Am I incorrect?
No,
that's fine.
Sure. Yeah. Either Professor Kennedy or Professor Darity, whoever wants to.
Well, let me defer to Professor Kennedy. Go ahead, because he hasn't had a chance to speak yet.
No, I was simply going to say that in terms of setting a groundwork for our discussion, I'm happy that in the definition, segregation has been mentioned a number of times. Oftentimes, when we think about the reparations discussion, slavery bulks very large, and obviously it probably should and it can. I think, though, that sometimes it's useful to think about the age of segregation, because the age of segregation does, it's more recent. It's part of living history. Oftentimes, when we think about reparations and slavery, people say, well, yeah, but there are no more slaves. The slaves are dead. The slaveholders are dead. That's long, long, long ago, as if this was a time when the dinosaur roamed. Well, the fact of the matter is there are millions and millions and millions of people who are alive who have been touched by the segregation regime. And I think that by talking about segregation, Boris Bitker, in his book, wonderful book, The Case for Black Reparations, made a point of urging a focus on segregation to get out, to make people think about how present the history of racial oppression has been. It's not long, long ago with people who were dead. Nope. It's people who are alive with us. Our parents, our siblings. The segregation regime is something that is part of our living memory. That's the only point that I'd like to make. Professor Darity, go right ahead.
No, I think we're in agreement here. I was going to say that the same people who say that slavery happened so long ago are frequently the same people who walk around with the trappings in the Confederacy. So there's some inconsistency in terms of their view about what is past and what is not past. But I think that the important point that Professor Kennedy is making is that it's the post-slavery period that needs to be something that is drawn fully into the picture for the case for reparations. And I would argue that it's federal policies that took place in the aftermath of slavery that have maintained and perpetuated this enormous racial wealth gap. I would start with the point at which the formerly enslaved were promised 40-acre land grants as restitution for their years of bondage, land that they never received, while 1.5 million white American families received 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories under the Homestead Act, as the nation completed its colonial settler project in the Western Territories. Trina Shanks-Williams estimates now that there are 45 million living white Americans who continue to be beneficiaries of the Homestead Act land patents. In addition, as I mentioned, there were upward of 100 massacres that took place across the nation, conducted by white terrorists, where they seized and appropriated Black-owned property. That was another mechanism for deepening the Black-white wealth gap. And then in the 20th century, the federal government shifts away from land distribution as its means of asset building to home ownership and the promotion of home ownership. And it does this in a highly discriminatory fashion. We can start with the presence of restrictive covenants that are supplanted by a federal policy of redlining, which was a public-private partnership between the Federal Housing Administration and local banks. And then we had the GI Bill, where the home ownership provisions in the GI Bill, the subsidies and supports for home ownership, were overwhelmingly given to returning white veterans from World War II and not given in any significant degree to returning Black veterans from World War II, further reinforcing the racial wealth gap. So it's a host of things that took place after slavery ended that are really critical from my standpoint in the case for reparations.
Can I ask Professor Darity, listen, American history is awash in injustice. And let's just focus on, for now, let's just focus on the injustice that was imposed upon African Americans. I think, you've, in your work, you've shown this, and, in your exposition, you've shown this, altogether clear. Here's my basic, and I'm not fighting with you, frankly. I think, yes, this injustice is with us. It has current effects. My main question to you, though, is how are we going to how do we translate your sense of this tremendous injustice into working policy? Because, I mean, it's not like you can force the United States government or state governments or municipal governments to do something. You've got to persuade people to do these things. My question to you is, how do you persuade people to, channel large amounts of resources to African Americans, even though American society is still awash in racism? I mean, that's the problem that you confront. How do you propose to confront that problem?
Well, I think that I'm not sure that there's a good answer to your question, because this is a tough one. But I will say that I think that there has been a change that has taken place in the political climate in the United States. And the ultimate question is whether or not the recalcitrant 30% of the population that insist on preserving minority rule and is willing to actually conduct a coup d'etat to try to preserve that minority rule, is whether or not they will continue to exercise disproportionate power. I think that the remaining 70% of the American population is open and potentially receptive to the type of plan of restitution that we've been describing. It's interesting to note that if you go back to the year 2000, a survey that was conducted by Ravana Popoff and Michael Dawson at the University of Chicago on American attitudes towards reparations found that 4% of white Americans endorsed monetary payments as reparations for Black Americans. If you get to the year 2021, a survey conducted at UMass Amherst now indicates that it's closer to 30% of white Americans. So that's a sea change, even if we're not at a point at which the majority of white Americans are in a position to endorse Black reparations. And I think it's that sea change that lies at the heart of the intense opposition that is being demonstrated by some segments of the population towards so-called critical race theory. Because I think there's a recognition that the American public is learning more and more about its true and accurate history, and as a consequence, will be open to an act of restitution.
See, you have a more generous view of the American, American public than I do. I mean, you talk about the 30% that are recalcitrant. My reading of it is, yep, you got that 30%, but you got a much larger number, larger group who say, listen, yep, there was slavery, yep, there was segregation, yep, there was a lot of terrible things, but world history is awash with misery. World history is awash with terrible things. I'm interested. I can imagine people saying, we can't repair all of the terrible things that have happened through history because there's just so much atrocity. What we can do, however, good folks, I think, say what we can do is try to create public policy that will be helpful for those who are living and going forward. I mean, I must say, I don't think there's going to be much of an appetite for trying to, on your level, get right with the atrocities of the past, because there's so many atrocities, they go so deep, it's so broad, it's so overwhelming. I think people feel overwhelmed by it.
But there are atrocities for which reparations has been paid. So what makes the degree of damage that's been inflicted on Black Americans so exceptional that we would not attempt to make a concerted effort to address that specific set of harms and damages?
So
Japanese Americans have
about
received reparations payments.
Yeah.
Families that lost loved ones in the course of the 9/11 attacks, for which the United States government itself was not responsible, have received payments. And the individuals who were held hostage in Iran have received $10,000 per day in restitution, which comes to $4.4 million for the typical recipient. And the United States government didn't hold them hostage. So there are many instances in which people have been subjected to harms in which reparations have been paid. I'm not sure why you want to make the case for Black Americans continue to be the outlier of an injustice that has not been addressed by the United States government, which lies fully in the hands of the United States government.
I think our moderator wants to break in here.
Well, what we're stepping or talking around, I think, is the social and political perceptions of African Americans in the United States, right? And so other groups might seem more sympathetic politically. And I think Professor Darity is right that we are seeing shifts. I mean, after the, we'll call it the racial reckoning of the summer of 2020, attitudes did start to shift, thinking about what is the source of racial disparities, and can we be more sympathetic to the history and experiences of Black Americans in the United States. So I think that's one aspect, right? How do we think about this group? And I'm not sure we're going to get answers anytime soon about how to change that. But does time matter? And also does form matter? That is, part of what made Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece so popular was that he started with redlining, right? He started in the 1950s and 60s, and that felt more immediate to people. So does it matter how far back we decide to think about what needs to be repaired? And two, does the structure or the form of reparations matter? Will people be less open to cash payouts, right? Based in part on stereotypes about Black people and money, like the welfare queen stereotype comes to mind. Or are people going to be more open to more structural interventions, massive investments in
welfare
schools?
Queen, like the former Green Bay Packer quarterback in Mississippi?
Yes, right. So this is right. So it's the way we think about these terms and who applies to is absolutely race. And so do White Americans be more open to more structural interventions, massive school investment, changes to healthcare policy, better welfare policies for families? Does that matter?
I think all of it matters. It seems to me, and to go back to an earlier point that you put your finger on, I think that we really do have to be attentive to the continuing existence of, racism in our polity. I think that Professor Darity, you're exactly correct when you sort of went down a list. What about 9/11? People were very quick to, we got to help these people. There's an emergency. There was this tremendous emotional embrace of people who were victimized by people, it wasn't the United States government, it was other people. You might very well have said, geez, that's really too bad, but why should I have to pay with my tax dollars for that? I can imagine people saying that, but they did not. Similarly, you're exactly right. Why is it that with respect to the struggle over Japanese Americans and their treatment during World War II, it was a very different sort of stance than the stance that one gets when we're talking about African Americans. Why? In part because African Americans are still stigmatized. In part because there are millions of people who, as soon as you say slavery, there are millions of Americans who actually say, who actually think, they might not say it, but they actually think, actually Black people were saved from Africa.
Sure.
They were brought to the United States. They got the benefit of becoming Christianized. They got the benefits of coming to the United States. Frankly, they should thank God that they're in the United States and that they're not in, let's say, Angola. That is still very much a part of this discussion. The fact of the matter is that Black people are still stigmatized. And part of the stigmatization is not only an opposition to the idea of reparations, but actually a contemptuous opposition. That's part of our story. Now, what about this as a partial response? Because it seems to me that that's there, and it's sentimental not to take that into account. But what about this as a partial response? Listen, because of the history of racial oppression in the United States, Black Americans are needy in various ways. Various ways they are vividly needy. What about saying
paternalistic? Could you use a different term besides needy?
The term is, yeah.
What?
There are disparities, right? There are disparities, right? As a result of history in the United States, there are disparities.
Deeply paternalistic. I was just hoping you
Okay, well, I mean,
I don't even like the term repair, actually, even though I do use the term reparations. But okay, go ahead.
For various reasons, if you take a look at the various indicia of well-being, or the opposite of, or disadvantage, Black Americans are going to be disadvantaged in, practically everything you can look at, from, lifespan to vulnerability to various disease, to vulnerability to incarceration, the whole gamut. And all of these things are tied to the history of racial oppression. I think we can agree on that. How about, though, there's a big country, Black Americans are a minority. In order to move the levers of public policy, you're going to have a whole lot of people. What about saying we need to push resources to those who need more resources? Now, it's certainly the case that there are a lot of Black Americans who need resources, but the fact of the matter is there are a lot of white Americans who need resources too. Why not make need the central arbiter as opposed to the history of the need?
So from my perspective, reparations is not an anti-poverty program. It's a policy that should be introduced for the purposes of meeting an unmet debt. And specifically, it should be used for the purpose of eliminating the racial wealth gap in the United States, which is a huge disparity, a chasm, if you will, between opportunity and economic security between Black and white Americans. And it's a chasm that exists at all levels of the class distribution in the United States. So, for example, at the upper end of the wealth distribution, 1/4 of white American families have a level of net worth in excess of $1 million, which is true for only 4% of Black American families. At the bottom end of the distribution, whites in the lowest end of the income distribution, the poorest 20% of whites, have a higher level of wealth at the median than all Black Americans taken together. And so this is a profound issue that cannot be resolved by some sort of universal need-based program. And in fact, I'm strongly in favor of such universal needs-based programs. I'm an advocate of an economic bill of rights for the 21st century, which would include a federal job guarantee and the like. But I recognize that these kinds of steps would not eliminate the racial wealth gap. Universal programs will not eliminate the racial wealth gap. Indirect race-specific programs will not eliminate the racial wealth gap. People frequently talk about giving Black Americans scholarships. But if you look at the data carefully, you'll find that Black heads of household with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of households who never finished high school. This is all a function of the intergenerational transmission of wealth advantage that is held by white households in contrast with Black households. I think the last comment I'd like to make in this context is, I don't think we should be imprisoned by inaccurate and false beliefs that might be held by a significant segment of the population. As I said earlier, there's 30% of the American population that's wholly intractable. There's another 30% that now says that they favor reparations for Black Americans. So the struggle has to be persuading the remaining 40% that reparations is the right thing to do. And clearly it is. And now we're at a point at which we're addressing the logistical dimensions in a detailed way. And that's a major step beyond simply arguing over whether or not reparations is a good or a bad thing.
Wouldn't you agree that there's only a certain amount of time, energy, resources that can be devoted to channeling resources to various parts of the population? If that is true, don't we have to make choices about priorities? So for instance, for you, Professor Darity, if you were put to the choice of either of, economic Bill of Rights, universal economic Bill of Rights, as opposed to reparations for African Americans, if it was a choice of which of those two things you were going to prioritize, which one would you choose to prioritize?
Well, first of all, I don't want to accept the scarcity principle.
Well, why not? I mean, don't you
I think
have
we can
to?
do both. We can absolutely do both. In a country of 300 million people, there should be a sufficient amount of energy and effort that can be put forward to accomplish both sets of goals. However, if you were
haven't done either one.
If you're asking me what to prioritize, independent of the question of whether or not we have to choose one or the other, I am going to prioritize reparations at this point because it's a debt that's been unpaid for close to 160 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is this about both, Professor Darity, you were very clear that there is a specific economic component that needs to be responded to. So it doesn't just seem as if it's about a symbolic value, right? Although in your response about there's a debt that has to be paid, there's something here that's sort of psychic, like this is owed, right? But it seems to me that you're also making a point that
consequence. It's a consequence of the intergenerational ramifications of the failure to meet that obligation in the aftermath of the Civil War, and what it has meant in terms of the opportunities and lack of economic security for living Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States.
So I want to talk a little bit then about how we figure out who's eligible. I think there might be places of convergence and divergence here for both of you. Professor Darity, I know you've talked about this in detail. Who would be eligible for reparations, assuming we were going to move forward with policy reparations for Black Americans?
So it would be the descendants of the freedmen who were denied the 40-acre land grants. And so this would be living Black Americans who have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And so, Kirsten Mullen and I have advanced two criteria, which are related to what I just said. The first is a lineage standard. An individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. The quality of genealogical research that's been done on the African American community is extraordinary now. So this is something that is not an impossible mission by any means. And in our book, we actually advocate that the federal government provide free genealogical services to anyone who's trying to establish a claim on those grounds. But there's a second criteria that must be met also, which we refer to as an identity standard. An individual would have to have self-reported or self-identified themselves as Black, Negro, African-American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before the adoption of a reparations plan or a study commission for reparations to be eligible to receive the benefits of this program.
Can I push back on you a little bit on this one? Because I must say that this aspect of your project I find disturbing. Let me try to push back first.
As a Black South Carolinian,
yes. In fact, let's start there. That's right.
There. Okay.
I was born in 1954 in Columbia, South Carolina. It is very likely. I'd be willing to put a lot of money on this proposition that my people were enslaved in South Carolina. It's probably right. I haven't done genealogical study, but it's very likely that my forebears were enslaved. On the other hand, there were some Black South Carolinians in the age of slavery who owned slaves. Now, just suppose we did a little bit of study and it turns out that my people were among the people who somehow got from under slavery and became enslavers. If that was
that's irrelevant from my standpoint. It doesn't matter who the enslavers were, as long as you have at least one ancestor who was enslaved, then you meet the first part of the criteria. The second part involves the question of whether or not you are currently living as somebody who is a Black American. I don't want to give reparations to people who are living as white Americans who might also have ancestors who were enslaved in the United States. But it's irrelevant who the slave owners were.
Okay,
the question is whether or not you had any ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. Virtually all of us have white ancestors who potentially were slave owners, and that does not obviate the horrors that have been inflicted on people who are descendants of the persons who were freed at the end of the Civil War.
Okay, let me ask a somewhat different on the ADOS. So Black America is a complicated polity. You got Black Americans like me.
And like me, I'm like you.
What about one thing that I'm a little bit worried about, though, very worried about. What about Black people who hail from, Jamaica, Antigua, Nigeria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Before I get to that, let me be clear. Are you saying that reparations is a good idea, but you want it to include other people? Or are you still hammering away at your sets of questions about the significance and importance of adopting a reparations plan?
I'm not, listen.
Because, all your concerns seem to be logistical, ultimately. I don't think you disagree with the idea of the importance and relevance of reparations.
Yeah, I don't.
You just keep asking questions about, well, this would go wrong, or this might go wrong, or this can't be done quite this way.
Two things. Number one, I am not going to go to war against, your project for reparations, largely because, frankly, for me, I'm more into. I prefer the framework of distributive justice as opposed to reparative justice. But frankly, the reparative justice route gets me much of what I want. So, I'm not going to squawk. If we were in a political philosophy seminar room, maybe we would have differences, but frankly, the reparationist project, as far as I can see it, largely aims at getting money and other resources to people who are in need. And to that extent, I'm with it. I do think, however, that the logistical issues really are important and the political issues. And one thing that I have in mind, to go back to my question, I'm very afraid of dividing Black America along lines of, well, whose people were here in the, before the Civil War. Is that a concern? Should I be concerned about that? Or are you saying I ought not be concerned about that?
Well, I frankly, I think that type of division already exists. And it's something that requires a great deal of sensitivity to address, but it is a problem that's already present. You may want to argue that the debate over reparations is aggravating that division, but the division is definitely there already.
Yes, and will it be aggravated?
Well, if it is aggravated by doing the right thing, then by all means aggravate it. I am not worried about antagonizing individuals or groups of people as a basis for not doing the right thing. Okay. You are always going to antagonize somebody. And so the question is whether or not it is the appropriate thing to do. And I want to argue that if we are talking about reparations that's associated with the descendants of the persons who were the freedmen in the aftermath of the Civil War, then it is appropriate to talk about them as the recipients of reparations. And here's why. The first thing that matters is the fact that it is the freedmen who were not given the 40-acre land grants. That condition does not apply to other Black people across the diaspora. They do not have that United States specific experience. They may well have claims for reparations. In fact, I would argue that they do, but they don't necessarily have claims for reparations from the United States government. So if somebody is of Haitian ancestry, there definitely is a claim to be made on France. That's a case where there might also be a claim to be made on the United States government. But if we think about the British Caribbean, all of those countries that now constitute independent nations like Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, all of them have a claim on the United Kingdom. And I think that's wholly unambiguous. But it is Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved here, who were denied the 40-acre land grants that they were promised, who have a specific claim on the United States government. And I don't see anything intrinsically divisive about that, but if some people feel provoked by that, then so be it.
This is a question about social costs, right? Professor Darity, you're suggesting that there might be social costs of reparations, but on balance, it's worth it. And Professor Kennedy, you might be suggesting that the social costs might not be worth it, especially if you believe there are other ways to get there. And I think you both disagree about whether there are, in fact, other ways. So I want to flip the question. What is the social cost of not having a focused conversation or thought project or political movement for reparations for Black Americans in the United States, right? That is, if we abandon this project and think we're going to do something that's broader or more universal based on societal-wide disparities, what are the political and social or cultural costs there?
Oh, there are costs because, I mean, obviously there are people who have invested very strongly in a reparationist project and are going to feel wronged if that doesn't proceed. And, is that a social cost? Yeah, it's a social cost. And I think it's an important one that people ought to take into account.
So the social cost is not purely attitudinal. It's substantive. And the most substantive consideration is the following. For 160 years, Black Americans have been seeking full citizenship in the United States. And it would require a reparations plan for Black Americans to have the material basis for full citizenship. This contrasts a bit with the Native American community, whose goal and objective, as I understand it, is primarily considerations of sovereignty. But if we are substantively concerned about the citizenship status, the effective citizenship status of Black Americans, then the only way this can be accomplished is through a full-scale reparations plan.
After 2020, we saw, what we could call historic protests for racial justice. By 2022, I'd say we're seeing some backlash to that. And so does the current context provide any insights for the viability or possibility of reparations in the United States? Is it more needed than ever, or does it tell us something about how difficult the political road might be ahead for a reparations project?
I think that the current, landscape shows us it's been difficult and will continue to be difficult. I mean, after all, we're talking just a couple of weeks ago, the United States Supreme Court was hearing the latest affirmative action case involving the very institution that is helping to sponsor this wonderful forum. Now, affirmative action is a sort of, it seems to me, in higher education, is a very interesting item, because there it seems what we've really had is a disguised reparations project. The Supreme Court of the United States basically said, no, you can't have racial affirmative action on explicit reparations grounds. That's what Bakke. So they came up with something else, namely a diversity rationale. But the diversity rationale, actually, that was nominal. The thing that was really pushing it was a sense that, these people have been wronged and we need to do something to repair that. I think that affirmative action, at least with Black Americans, was very largely reparations based with this diversity cover. I think what is about to happen, however, is that we're about to lose that. And I think that the pushback against a very modest, good grief, the affirmative action in higher education was a very modest thing. But even that modest reform is going to be, from what I can tell, taken back. And that is a sign of how unwelcome racial reformism is, regardless of the theory that is under, regardless of the theory in which it is pitched.
So I want to go back to my point about minority rule. And I want to argue that the existing Supreme Court is really part of the architecture of minority rule in the United States. And so that's one of the central questions as to whether or not we will restore an environment in which the majority of Americans are actually making decisions about what happens in this country. So I don't want to view the Supreme Court's decision as an indicator of widespread beliefs across the entire American population. We know that this is a court that was designed to promote the position of a minority perspective in the United States. However, that said, affirmative action from my perspective is not reparations. It's not a form of reparations. It's an anti-discrimination measure. And on top of that, to the extent that it's effective, and I think Professor Kennedy's absolutely right that it's been applied quite modestly. If we look at the demographic composition of the faculties at the most elite universities in the United States, we can't say that a heck of a lot has really happened over the course of the past 30 years. And so affirmative action has been modest in its impact. But if we want to think about what its implications are, if it's more effectively applied, It has an impact on income inequality, but it has very little effect on wealth inequality. And so once again, we're confronted with this issue of what do we do about the racial wealth gap? And affirmative action is not something that can contribute anything significant to elimination of the racial wealth gap.
So we've been talking about this. Oh, I wanted to go ahead. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was going to say we've been talking about it a bit abstractly, and so I want to make it more focused and think about HB 40, right, as a political step in moving towards reparations. And I'd like to know, Professor Darity, whether you support that move. What do you think the future of that move is? And Professor Kennedy, to the extent that you've been raising concerns about how would this work, right? What do you think about just establishing a congressional inquiry to try to understand how would it work, Professor Darity?
So I think that the idea of having some form of a congressional inquiry or a presidential commission, for that matter, to develop and design appropriate proposals for reparations is not a bad idea. It was a strategy that was pursued as a prelude to the Japanese American reparations. There was a commission that produced a very important report that prompted the development of a plan of reparations for Japanese Americans. And so I don't think that that's a bad idea. I do think that HR 40 is a terrible piece of legislation. And so I do not view it as providing a stepping stone to a comprehensive reparations plan. And I don't think I should elaborate at this point, but I would like to refer people to an editorial that Kirsten Mullen wrote for Bloomberg, in which she detailed the weaknesses in HR 40, and I encourage people to take a look at that.
Great. Professor Kennedy?
I don't know, frankly, about I haven't studied the legislation to which you refer. The general idea, however, of having a commission, having some, deliberation about this, it seems to me to be a good idea. Serious people have been thinking about this for for a long period of time. It seems to me that this conversation needs to be going on and reinforced and facilitated along with other conversations. The thing I would say is we need to have honest, open discussion in which people really lay their cards on the table. And to the extent that that can be done in government, to the extent that that can be done in our universities, we should take every opportunity to do that. One other point, I guess, with Professor Darity, when he was talking about the Supreme Court, I would agree. I don't think that the Supreme Court's rulings are, what the Supreme Court says is a good indication of what the majority of Americans think. Having said that, however, the majority of Americans may think things that are completely stupid. I don't take any solace in being with, frankly, a majority. And in my view, we face a public opinion that has built within it ideas that are profoundly destructive. I'm with you, Professor Darity. I think that you're absolutely right when you say, listen, what we have to think about is what is appropriate. We need to take into account political realities. We need to take into account maybe what a majority of people think in terms of just, so that we won't be sentimental, so that we won't, if we want to be realistic and pushing things forward, we have to take everything into account. But when you say that, what ultimately matters is our view of what is right, on that, I would agree with you. And I think that we need to, have forums like this in which people really put their cards on the table.
Yeah, I would say that the existence of forums like this, which are increasing in presence, is actually another positive indicator of the willingness of more and more Americans to take seriously the idea of reparations. And when I first started working on this about 30 years ago, and I was a reparations skeptic at that point, I thought not that I didn't think reparations was a bad idea. I just thought it was something that would never happen. Mm-hmm. And as I was asked to write an introduction for a volume called The Wealth of Races by an economist named Richard America. Mm-hmm. That's really his name, Richard F. America. And mm-hmm. And he insisted that I write the introduction despite my skepticism. And I think there was some method in his madness, because as I read the essays that were contributions to that volume, I began to say to myself, well, it doesn't really matter how hard this is going to be to make happen. It's so much the right thing that I'm going to invest my time and energy and research skills in an effort to try to design an appropriate program and push for it. And it was at that point that I said, well, if you think about previous points in time, say it was 1817 in the United States, you might be convinced that slavery would never come to an end. But would that be a justification for not opposing it? And my answer was, of course not. It would not be a justification for not opposing it, just being pessimistic about the prospects of it happening. And so that's how I got on the path to thinking about reparations.
Our trajectories are interesting, because I guess the trajectory of my thinking is the flip of yours.
Okay.
So I think that 25 years ago, I would have been much more embracing of reparationist logic and the reparationist, feeling. And I think that over time, I've gone away from that and am more claimed by, like I say, redistributionist, distributive justice, or to put it a little different way, if I have two people in front of me, and one person is in need because of, I don't know, they just came to these shores, they just washed up on these shores, but they are in deep need. I want a polity that responds to their need. Why? Because they are in need. Now, person number two is in need as well, but their need is linked to a history of racial oppression in America. I want to know, inquiring minds want to know. I want to know about the history of these two needs. But what's ultimately grabbing me is the need of both. And it's that issue of need that grabs me more than the issue of the history of the need. And I guess what concerns me is, at least with some reparationists, I get the sense that it's the history of the need that actually is more important than the present sense of desperate need itself.
Well, again, I don't start with the scarcity principle that you're adopting, that you have to make a choice between supporting people in these two different sets of circumstances. But what I do think is it should be different types of resources that should be forthcoming under each set of circumstances. It's not solely the historical record that's at play. It's the consequences of that historical record for the living individuals. And so from my standpoint, it's a question of justice that I'm trying to address. And it requires an investigation of the reasons why individuals are in the conditions that they are today, if one is trying to be concerned about creating a more just and fair society.
So I do want to remind our participants that they can ask questions. I want to go to some of the questions now. One interesting question was about reparation proposals that had been presented to UNC for the descendants of slaves who were owned by the university. And for me, that's actually a question about the level at which reparations has to take place, right? Is it possible for state or local government or smaller entities, Asheville, the city of Asheville, for example, agree to engage in some sort of reparation work in that for their town? Is it possible for smaller entities to do that work? Or is this something that has to be done at a federal level, something that has to be done with wide consensus about how to move forward?
It depends heavily on what the
Darity.
objective is. And since I'm committed to the view that a reparations project must be designed in such a way that it eliminates the racial wealth differential in the United States by building the assets that are possessed by Black Americans to a level that is similar to the average level that is held by white Americans, then state and local initiatives are simply not going to do the trick. Individual initiatives or private organizations' actions are not going to turn the trick either. I think people may not fully appreciate how large a number $14 trillion is. So let me give two illustrations that might be useful. If generous donors put $1 billion into a fund for reparations on a monthly basis, so $12 billion per annum, and the typical university that is engaged in some act of atonement is usually talking about no more than $100 million. And most of the cities that are doing something like Evanston or Providence, Rhode Island, are talking about $10 million, okay? If generous donors put $1 billion into a fund on a monthly basis, it would take a millennium to get to $14 trillion, okay? If we think about the combined budgets of all state and local governments in the United States, that comes to less than $5 trillion. I'm talking about a bill, again, of $14 trillion. And so it is only the federal government that has the capacity to fund a project on that scale to address a long-standing historical injustice in the United States.
Mr. Kennedy, do you have any points of convergence there or divergence?
I guess my question would be, are there some things that are so large that they are beyond our capacity to rectify? I mean, you just talked about how big that was, how much money.
Yeah.
Does this mean then? I mean, I think, frankly, I kind of think of, would it be, just suppose it took everything in the United States, all assets, would you be willing to devote all assets in the United States to the addressing of the victimization of African Americans?
Well, there are people who have argued for numbers much, much higher than the one that I've talked about.
Okay.
If you were to talk to Thomas Kramer at the University of Connecticut, he would probably say that my $14 trillion figure is a low ball on the amount that would be required to close the racial wealth gap. And he would say it's probably $17 to $19 trillion. He's also been the architect of another estimate that he does not personally say should be used, but a lot of people have seized upon it, which is the amount of time that was stolen from the enslaved, an economic value assigned to the amount of time that was stolen from the persons who were enslaved, and that essentially 24 hours a day was stolen time. And that estimate comes to $6.2 quadrillion. I would not advocate trying to pay $6.2 quadrillion to anyone, in part because the inflationary consequences would be so severe that the worth of the money that you'd given people would be eliminated overnight. So yes, there is a ceiling on the amount that I would think is justifiable, but $14 trillion is manageable, given the United States government's response to the events of the Great Recession and to the pandemic.
Okay,
and you would not necessarily have to pay the $14 trillion out at one time. You could do it. I wouldn't want to do it any longer than a decade, but you could spread the money out across the course of a decade. And that would be an entirely manageable project for the federal government.
Okay, but you just have you have acknowledged that manageability is part of your calculus.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean,
Right.
There's a famous observation that Frederick Douglass made many years ago. He said it would be impossible to come up with an amount that would truly compensate the formerly enslaved for the horrors that they had been subjected to. But he said, it doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we've had some questions about logistics, and one is, Professor Darity, do you believe that if you got the number you wanted, it would actually close that gap? And how would that gap stay closed, assuming discrimination endures?
So once again, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I certainly, am an advocate of continuing to work to eliminate discrimination. But the key factor that produces the racial wealth gap is the unequal intergenerational transmission of resources between blacks and whites. And what a reparations plan would do of the type that I'm describing is it would interrupt that unequal distribution of resources. So the question then is there some reason to think that the racial wealth gap might reopen? And there are some people who've argued that that's a possibility. I would say that's only something to worry about if, in fact, the reason why it reopens is because of atrocities that have been directed to against Black Americans, in which case you reopen the case for reparations. And so you would have to ultimately eliminate the factors that produce the racial wealth gap to be able to have a sustainable reparations program where you could meet the third condition in our definition, which is closure.
Mr. Kennedy, any thoughts about that? I mean, I'm already hearing you. I'm already hearing a potential response about the difficulty we have as Americans about deciding what the source of problems are, right? And so how would we come to consensus that a reopened gap might be due to state sanctioned discrimination or racial subordination?
No, I don't have any further to add on that point.
So we had a question about thinking about reparations as sentimental. And this goes back to this question about stigma and how we think about different groups. And so is language like that signaling something about how we think about how meritorious each group is? Would we use words like sentimental for thinking about Holocaust survivors and their descendants, right? Or the descendants of people who were interned because they were Japanese? And this is really a question about rhetoric, right? How important is rhetoric here? And what does that tell us about the feasibility of this project?
Well, there are people who have said, don't use the term reparations because that raises some people's hackles, find another term. And my response is, I'm not trying to do this out of any course of deception. I want this to happen because the vast majority of Americans agree that it is something that should happen. And so we will try to persuade people with the language that is as honest as possible.
Mm-hmm. I respect that a great deal, Professor Darity. I really do. I think, transparency. In that spirit, let me ask you a question. So how do you deal with people who have done well. Let's suppose that their folks, like my folks in South Carolina, were enslaved, but over time, for various reasons, they've done extremely well. Do they get the benefit of reparations even though they have now done extremely well?
Yeah, well, I said earlier, reparations is not an anti-poverty program. It is not needs-based in terms of the criteria for eligibility.
Okay.
It is meant for the individuals who are the Black descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. And,
so Oprah
people did, yes,
reparations
would
too.
be perfectly eligible. LeBron James would be perfectly eligible.
Okay.
If these individuals chose not to receive reparations, then that's their discretion.
Mm-hmm.
Keep in mind, when reparations was paid to victims of the Holocaust, no one asked how well they were doing financially in that moment. When reparations were paid to Japanese Americans who had been unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II, no one asked how they were doing at that particular moment. That was not a factor that was involved in providing restitution for the harms that they had been subjected to. And the fact that a living Black American might be doing fairly well financially does not mean they have not been subjected to the harms of white supremacy.
No, it doesn't. And I would agree with that. The thing about history is so funny. I mean, how would you deal with the person who would say, you're absolutely right, and most of the time, oppression has very destructive consequences. We all know, however, that, social life is funny. There were some very beautiful things that were the upshot of, atrocity. So the blues, beautiful.
Jazz, blues.
Yes, and that's exactly right. And so, so if one were to say,
well, I mean, living
does that
Black
get factored
Americans,
in too?
Many of us who are living Black Americans would not be here at all if it was not for the rapes that our ancestor foremothers were subjected to. So you could say that there are some things that are beneficial outcomes of atrocities, but that doesn't mean that the kinds of economic conditions and differential opportunities that are associated with the racial wealth gap is not something that affects virtually all Black Americans today adversely. And that's what I'm focused on. I'm not focused on the question of cultural products and the like. I'm focusing on the question of differences in the capacity to exercise full citizenship in the United States that are anchored on monetary differences in resources.
Okay.
So we're going to wrap up soon, but I want to invite each of you to get a final word about this topic before we close. Professor Darity?
I just, first of all, just let me say I'm grateful for this event, for the conversation with Professor Kennedy, for your active and gracious moderation, and that I'm hoping that it is conversations like this that continue to produce an opportunity for people to think about reparations in a way in which they may not have in the past, in a more positive way that they may not have in the past. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join you all in this conversation.
Let me echo, I'd like to echo what Professor Darity just said. I think it's been a interesting and useful conversation. Differences have been voiced, and people have given their best insofar as trying to address their differences. I also want to end by giving a tip of the hat to Professor Darity. He has, for a long period of time, been focused on this subject and has very patiently and carefully sought to respond to all sorts of critics. And I really respect him for being so patient and so calm and so comprehensive in his efforts at responding to his critics. Not everybody is going to agree about things. And they're going to be perfectly responsible, sensible people who are going to disagree. And, intellectual work should be about trying to persuade people based on evidence, based on argument. And I think that Professor Darity has really been exemplary in showing how that's done. So I too want to thank our host, thank our moderator, and I very much appreciate being part of this forum.
Well, I echo both of your sentiments and thank you both for joining us. I also want to thank our participants for joining us tonight. Please don't forget there's a survey to fill out if you've enjoyed this programming. And a recording of this event is going to be available on YouTube. I hope you all join us again for our conversations in the future. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.